Hello, health champions. We keep hearing about how important carbohydrates are and how bad fat is and how losing weight is all about creating a calorie deficit. But if it's that simple, then why is 80% of the population overweight, and why is it getting worse so quickly? Let's talk about that. Calories in, calories out is often quoted as an irrefutable law of physics, and it is indeed true. However, that's not the whole picture. And very often, more important than learning the truth is unlearning that which is untrue. And here's how the calorie story usually goes. If you are hypothetically burning 3,000 calories per day and you want to lose some weight, you cut back to 2,500. Now you have a deficit of 500. So with 7 days a week, that's 3,500 calories per week. So now you're losing 1 pound per week. Simple enough. So you keep that up and every week you lose 1 more pound. And if you weigh 200 pounds, then all you have to do is to keep this diet up. Eat 2,500 calories for 200 weeks and you will weigh exactly 0. You will completely disappear. Now, how many people think that's going to happen? I didn't think so, because we know something changes along the way. The body doesn't like to disappear. It likes to stay alive. It likes its physical existence. So somewhere along the way, something changes. And in the beginning, we might be losing weight nice and steady, but after a while, after a few weeks, the weight loss plateaus. But we don't give up so easily. So now, instead of 2,500 calories, we cut down to 2,000. And again, we have a 500 calorie deficit. And the story repeats. So for a while, we lose a little bit more weight, but then after a while, the body has this sense of not wanting to disappear, so it changes something. It cuts back on the expenditure. It adapts. It spends less energy because it doesn't like to disappear. Whatever perception it has of the weight that it wants to keep is a set point, and it doesn't want to deviate too far from that set point. So we cannot simply count the calories and do the math and think that's going to happen. And this is what millions and millions of people experience every day, that they lose for a while and then it plateaus and then it starts going back up. And every time they do this, it gets a little bit harder. So this is not the solution. And yes, the law of physics, it's still true, but what it doesn't account for is that in a living organism, that organism has the ability to change things. One huge key to losing weight is to eat more unprocessed foods. But there's more to it than the usual story, which goes something like this: that you should eat more whole grain instead of white toast. And if you do that, we're told you're going to get so much more nutrients and so much more fiber, and it's absorbed much slower, and you will lose the weight. Well, here's the truth of it, that when it comes to vitamins and minerals, there is a significant difference, that for the most part, you lose anywhere from 5 to 80% of the vitamins and minerals when you go from whole grain to white. So there's a significant difference, but short term, that's not going to matter too much for weight loss. Then they say that there's so much more fiber, but turns out there's only 1.9 gram versus 1.1. So it's not insignificant. There is a difference, but it's not a huge difference. And then we're told that their net carb difference is different, but it turns out the net carbs only go from 10 to 12, and a huge portion of what matters is the glycemic index, which is a measurement of how quickly does that bread become broken down and digested and turn into blood sugar. And here we see the whole grain has a glycemic index of 74 and the white toast is about 75. So there's a myth here that there's a very, very small difference in terms of blood glucose and the impact on diabetes and weight loss and insulin. They are basically the same. So short term, there's really no difference. Long term, it does matter with the vitamins and minerals, but you're really better off skipping both of these. There are some grains though that are a good bit better, and some of them can get as low as into the 50s. But what we're talking about here is bread that looks like this. It's heavy as a brick. It basically sinks if you put it in water. That's how heavy it is. And you can see all of the individual kernels because they haven't broken down the kernels. They don't grind the flour to make this kind of bread. And it's the same thing if you're going to do oats. You want to do the steel cut oats where they don't grind it, they don't steamroll it. It's still the whole grain, and now it's absorbed much, much slower. You're also much better off if you do some ancient grain. That means something that we haven't destroyed with genetic manipulation. So rye is a good example. You also have things like barley, steel-cut oats. You have some old grains like emmer and einkorn and spelt. But stay away as much as you can from the modern wheat and stay away from things that are made from ground flour. Now, if you're type 2 diabetic, then I suggest you leave grains out altogether because even though 50 is a whole lot lower than 75, it's still not really a low glycemic food. However, if you are insulin sensitive, if you're metabolically healthy and you'd like to have some grain once in a while, then use these ancient grains, but I still don't think you should turn it into a staple. Have it once in a while in moderation. Like I use this one occasionally to make garlic bread. You toast it, you spread butter and garlic on it, and it's super delicious. But I might have that once a week. So what's much, much more important than calories is how does this food influence your body and how does that affect your behavior? So the first thing we have to understand is one of the keys is called blood sugar, blood glucose. And this is super, super important for the body to keep it regulated, to keep it within a very tight range. So imagine how tightly regulated this is. If you can eat 10 grams of carbohydrate, and if you're metabolically healthy, if everything is working, then shortly thereafter, whether it be 30 minutes or 60 or 90 minutes, your blood glucose is going to be within that narrow range of 80 to 90 milligrams per deciliter. And if you're metabolically healthy and you eat 200 grams of carbohydrate, then a little bit later might take a little bit longer, maybe 90 minutes to 2 hours, but you will still be in that same range. That is how incredibly powerful the body is and how important it is for the body to keep it in that tight range. And the body uses different hormones to accomplish this. So when you eat a carbohydrate and your blood glucose goes up, the body releases a hormone called insulin that acts as a guide for that glucose to get it out of the bloodstream and into the cell. So one of the keys to losing weight is to stabilize blood sugar, not just to lower it or keep it in a certain range, but to stabilize it and keep it from fluctuating too much. Because here's what happens. If you eat something that is quickly absorbed, a lot of carbohydrate that's absorbed quickly, now you get a glucose spike. That food gets quickly into your bloodstream, your blood glucose goes up, and now your body has to act on an emergency, because if that glucose goes too high, that's very dangerous for your brain. You could actually get into a coma if that gets totally out of control. So as soon as it starts rising, your body releases insulin, and if you have a glucose spike, you get an insulin spike, a corresponding insulin spike. So here's basically what that looks like. So if this is the range where your body is doing okay, and let's say that it's a little bit lower because you have unstable glucose, and then you eat something and your glucose goes up. And then shortly thereafter, your insulin responds to that, and you get this insulin spike. And then when insulin is high, it guides the glucose out of the bloodstream, so now glucose drops again. But if we have a lot of insulin because we had a lot of glucose, then it tends to overshoot, especially if this is going on for a while. So now your glucose is low, and now you get hungry and you eat something. So now your glucose starts going up again. And the insulin, which was on its way down, now responds to that new insulin spike, and it pushes the glucose down, and so on and so forth. And every time that your glucose is really low, now that's another emergency for the body. So now the body releases a hormone called cortisol to raise blood sugar. So there's two ways that you can deal with this low blood sugar. That's to release cortisol to make new glucose in the liver, and the other way, of course, is to eat. So you're going to make cortisol and you're going to get cravings, and so you keep this roller coaster going. And this is why these blood sugar swings also leads to more cravings, because every time that your glucose is low, then your brain doesn't have the fuel that it's used to. Because if you always eat carbohydrates, then you're teaching your body to only use carbohydrates. So when it drops a little bit, your body doesn't know what to do. You get a little lightheaded, you get a little irritable, and you probably recognize that when you're irritable is when you had the cravings. That's when you reach for something. And the more cravings you have, the more you tend to start snacking. And the more snacking you do, the more you increase your food, you increase your caloric intake, and you also increase your calorie storage, of course, especially when you have these blood sugar swings, because every time that insulin is high and it pushes this glucose down, whatever glucose you can't use in that moment has to be stored. And you have a very limited ability to store carbohydrate. You can only store so much in the liver, and when that storage is full, all the rest of this glucose gets converted to fat. So this insulin, whenever it's high, it pushes the glucose into a cell, but this insulin is also promoting the conversion of glucose to fat. So every time that you have this roller coaster, then you're promoting fat storage. Another popular concept is to front load your calories. And what does that mean? Well, most people, if we look at a 24-hour day, then at midnight they're still sleeping, then they wake up in the morning and they tend to have a small quick breakfast because they're in a hurry, so they just grab something. And then they sit down for lunch and they have a little bit more time, but they're still kind of rushed. And then they come home for dinner and they eat most of their food in the evening. And the problem with this is that assuming that they eat a certain percentage of carbohydrates through all these meals, then for a small meal, you get a small insulin spike. For a larger meal, you get a larger insulin spike. And for the biggest meal, you get the biggest insulin spike. And then you go to bed, and then you might have some additional snacks in between here, because a lot of people do. But this is what you don't want to do. This is the opposite of front loading, because here you're back loading. You're eating most of the food. You're creating the biggest insulin spike just before you go to bed. So it's going to take the body a good amount of time to process this food. And when you go to bed, you're not really going to use a whole lot of it. So front loading means that instead you eat your biggest meal in the morning, and then you have a smaller meal for lunch and your smallest meal at dinner time. And just like we saw before, now you have the biggest insulin spike. You can store the most in the morning, early in the day, and then you eat less and less, you store less and less. So you have a chance as you go through the day to burn through some of that. And then as you go to bed, there's not all this insulin that's going to start acting on storing food for you into fat. And this relates to how much time your body actually spends in fat burning. So if you eat your biggest meal toward the end of the day, let's say at 7 o'clock, then by midnight, you've barely started burning fat. You're still putting fat, you're putting calories away, turning them into fat. So let's hypothetically say that it gets to midnight before you start burning fat. Now you have 7 hours to burn fat and allow that insulin to drop throughout the night before you wake up and start all over. Whereas if you start with the biggest meal and finish with the smallest, you've already processed through some of that and you get a couple of hours of fat burning before midnight. And then you still have the 7 hours here, plus there are much lower insulin levels going into the sleep. So you probably get more fat burning here than even you do in the beginning of this period. So here you have about 7 hours of fat burning, but with the other model here, with the front loading, you might get 9 hours of fat burning. So there's two benefits to that. You get a longer period of fat burning, but you also finish the day with a much lower level of insulin. So once you go to sleep, that low level is allowed to continue to decrease and get lower and lower. So by the time you have your first meal, you probably much lower insulin. You've allowed your body to reverse some of that insulin resistance by the time you get into having your first meal. But if we really understand these principles, we can take this one step further. So let's say instead of having that breakfast meal, we just skip breakfast altogether because we still have some food. The body is not going to run out. It's just a habit. And instead, we have a larger meal for lunch and about the same size for dinner. So depending on how hungry you are, you eat until you're full, right? You don't force food, you don't eat excessively, but you also don't deprive yourself. You eat until you're full. And if you understand what triggers insulin, which is glucose, now if you eat more protein and fat and less carbohydrate, now you can eat till you're full. You can eat to satiety and still only make about half as much insulin. It doesn't take much insulin to process that food because your blood sugar is much more stable. There are no huge swings to respond to. One analogy is that if you eat high carb, it's like putting gasoline on a fire. But if you eat low carb, it's like you put a log on the fire. It's going to keep you warm for hours instead of minutes. And then your second meal, of course, also will be low carb. So you still get that low trigger of insulin. And now, even though you ate a bigger meal, because your insulin levels are lower overall, you get into fat burning faster. So you still get that couple of hours before midnight, but now you have a full 12 hours from midnight to lunch when you have your first meal. So instead of 7 or 9, now you get 14 hours. So you get twice as much time in fat burning as the first example, but you also benefit from the overall lower insulin levels. So if your insulin levels are already high, if you have trouble losing weight, then this top model is going to be very difficult to reduce weight with. Whereas if you drop to the bottom here, that would be your best bet to really allow that insulin to reverse, the insulin resistance to drop long term. So here's the meal plan. First, you lower your carbs a little bit so that you can stop snacks. You start stabilizing your blood sugar and you cut out the snacks. It might be a little uncomfortable for just a couple of days, but your body will get used to it very, very quickly. And then you start looking at the feeding window, the time period during the day that you're eating. So let's say you're starting at 12 hours, and then you put your breakfast a little bit later and your dinner a little bit earlier, so you're down to 10 hours. Now there is 14 hours without food that you can actually burn some fat instead. And then you keep doing this. You put the breakfast a little later until it becomes lunch. You put the dinner a little bit earlier until you go from 10 to 8 to 6 hours of feeding window. Then at the same time, you go from 3 meals a day down until you only need 2 meals a day. And for most people, that's going to be plenty. You're going to get great results there. However, if your body is super stubborn, or if you prefer to try it and see if it works, and if you feel good at it, you can go down to 1 meal per day. It also doesn't hurt to change things up a little bit so your body doesn't get stuck in any one pattern. So you can plan your actual meal a million different ways, but you start with the protein. It could be beef, but get the best quality that you have access to. It could be fish. Try to get wild caught if you can. It could be poultry. It could be chicken, wild birds, turkey. Could be wild game, could be venison, elk, buffalo, bison, you name it. Anything that is raised properly on food that is proper for that species is a good source of protein. If you're a vegetarian or a lacto-ovo-vegetarian, this could be eggs, it could be tofu, it could be nuts and seeds, something that's a little bit more concentrated in protein. Then you add some vegetables, and these you want to emphasize the leafy greens like lettuce and spinach and kale and collard greens, or any leafy green that you like. It could be parsley or bok choy. It doesn't really matter. They're all mostly similar. Then you can also have some non-starchy vegetables like bell pepper and cauliflower and broccoli. If you're a little bit more insulin sensitive, if your body is not so stubborn, you could throw in a little bit of sweet potato or regular potato or other tubers. But if your body is pretty stubborn, or if you're a type 2 diabetic, then you want to stick with the non-starchy vegetables and the leafy greens. So you start with a moderate amount of the protein, and then you load up with as much vegetables as you can eat basically, and then you add in fat to satiety. You add enough fat to make it taste good. You add enough fat to feel full. And this fat could be natural fat as part of the meat or the fish. It could be added natural fat like butter or extra virgin olive oil, things that have been minimally processed. Coconut oil and ghee are also excellent choices. And remember, just because you hear that low-carb diets are high-fat diets, that keto you can eat a lot of fat, that does not mean that more fat is better. It's not the fat that does it, it's the lack of carbohydrate that does it, but you still need to eat enough fat to satiety. But if you are eating this way and you're stuffing yourself full of fat and you're not losing weight, then you're probably eating too much fat. So remember, moderate protein, greens as much as you can eat, and then fat to satiety. So if you notice that I sometimes say, if you are very insulin resistant, if your body is very stubborn. So how do you find out? What do I mean by that? Well, the best way really is to get some blood work and to understand what the blood work means. You want to understand your glucose, your A1C levels, your insulin levels, your triglycerides, and how all of that fits into your metabolic health and how that carries over to your cholesterol levels. So I have recently released a blood work course where people can learn more about that, because unfortunately most doctors don't really have much knowledge beyond just measuring the glucose level, and if it goes crazy then they say here's your metformin or your medication. But we can find out things 20 years earlier that can save us a lot of time and grief. So I put a link down below if you want to learn more about that course. If you enjoyed this video, you're going to love that one. And if you truly want to master health by understanding how the body really works, make sure you subscribe, hit that bell, and turn on all the notifications so you never miss a life-saving video.